Hey everybody, welcome to week 2 of the NaNoWriMo live stream. I'm Vincent Kashani, and I'm joined by two amazing author coaches. Emily Vanderbilt, the author of the young adult historical fantasy series, the Crimson Time series, and Mackenzie Finkley, the author of both the nonfiction book Beyond the Halls and the upcoming fiction book, The Artifact Hunter. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
Great for a Wednesday.
Yeah.
That's about as good as it can be. But it's about to get even better because we're discussing fiction versus nonfiction within NaNoWriMo. And so last week we sort of touched on the fact that this series of streams is going to be not just National Novel Writing Month, but for us here at Manuscripts, it's going to be a little bit more of National Book Writing Month. We're going to touch and focus on both sides of the coin. So let's get right into it. And the first thing we're going to kind of explore is that fiction side, the novel writing side. And Emily, this one's for you first. I'm curious to hear what you think. So, for fiction, what is the difference between plot, story, and character arcs? And how does a novelist balance these elements while drafting?
Yeah. So plot is more like the sequence of events in the story. So if you remember like back in grade school or high school where you would have to like plot the story, you'd have like the exposition on those graphs, rising action, climax, falling action, and then like your denouement or resolution. All of those individual like pinpoints that you were putting were events of the story. Those are more like external. They're like all the bells and whistles. They're the like big pieces of like the quest or the adventure that like your character's going on. Character arc is more like that personal journey of your character. It's more internal, even though there is some of those like external evidences of it in like how your character reacts or interacts in certain situations. And then story is sort of like overarching the two. It's almost like the marriage of like plot and character arcs. Or if you want to like think about it in a different way, it's that like external element mirrored or like coupled with that like internal element. I guess as far as like how you would go about balancing that when you're actually writing, is I always sort of err on the side of like start broader. So when you're doing your drafting, focus more on that story element and just getting it out on paper. And then sort of like narrow it down from there. So then when you're going into those subsequent like areas of like revisions and editing, then you're focusing more on like filling in like the plot holes and like anything that you've missed or doesn't make sense to the story. Or like I know for me, character arcs is something I always have to sort of like beef up or like pay a little bit more attention to when I'm doing my revisions. So yeah, you'll like find that the areas that maybe like you struggle in or don't necessarily come across as well in that first draft. And then those are the things that you'll keep like whittling down when you're revising.
Yeah, that's interesting because last week we did sort of talk about how character arcs, both you and I, Emily, struggle a little bit at first with while drafting, getting those right, and just
Yeah.
thinking them more as an element of the larger story is helpful. I would say while drafting, Mackenzie, what kind of strategies do you use, especially if you are in the process of getting?
Yeah, strategies and opinions. I would tend to agree. I think that character arc is really inherently tied to the story because character arc is something that's really is more easily developed through the course of events that drive the plot forward. So we're talking things that happen to your character and the choices they make as a result. Character arc ends up being, how that character changes over time. And that also is inherently tied to the story in that the reader's going to want some kind of resolution and change over time for the character, because hopefully you're opening with a hook and some kind of tension in your character's life. And then towards the end, there's some kind of resolution, much like you would kind of hope for in listening to music, right? You kind of hope it ends on a resolving chord, and doesn't leave you kind of going, what?
Definitely. Something that helped me that I wish I had known while drafting, I didn't find out about it until editing, was Dan Harmon's story circle for characters, or character circle, I believe. And I think it's an abridged version, and it's just 8 steps of the sort of changes that your character, if they're a dynamic character that's going through changes in your book, can have within an arc. And even if you guys don't, drafting your own stories don't follow that completely, I don't necessarily recommend it as like the be all end all. Just something as a guide that you can have in maybe bullet points about like that character arc, and really force yourself to write it out before you get into the writing process or as you're drafting, is really helpful. Because you, like, when you're thinking of it in your brain, it's almost, you almost think it's going to be easier than it is. And then when you actually like put it out there or put it on the page, like, you're forced to in detail say what that arc is, and you start to see flaws with it, or you start to think more about how it connects to the plot and forms the story. And I think that kind of knowledge is really helpful to go into before or while you're drafting. But something that might bleed over into nonfiction too, not necessarily with character arcs, but with that plot and that story aspect. And this is something I'm not as experienced with, so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on this, Mackenzie. Is for nonfiction, how does a writer maintain a narrative through line, and what does that concept sort of mean to you, and especially as it goes to nonfiction?
Yeah, so a narrative through line, nonfiction books are typically told from the perspective of a person, either the person who lived the thing or did the research about the thing. And to hold the audience's attention, it's actually really important to maintain storytelling. It's not so simple as just like compiling all the information and going, here it is. You still want to use storytelling elements. And by that, I mean, in this time, in this place, this is what happened. Like literally telling stories and giving anecdotes through your voice. That's what becomes that narrative through line. And a really good example of this is the opening kind of introduction to Atomic Habits by James Clear, I believe is his last name. And he does a really great job of painting this really graphic incident that happened to him, like this horrible, horrible accident that happened to him that I'm not going to go into because I read it and was like, oh, woof. But it really catches your attention and you're like, okay, well, so then what happened next? How did you bounce back from that? And then that's like what the rest of the book is about creating and developing and analyzing the concept of habits. And so stories like that one, capture the reader's attention and then also get to the heart of what the book is about, is really useful in engaging the reader throughout.
Would you say that a nonfiction's book's overall structure has to contribute to sort of a larger point or message for the book to really be effective? I know it depends on the topic, but I'm sort of thinking about that in terms of like maybe there's storytelling that's done within the structure of the book that contributes more so to like a theme or a point, and that's maybe where the story of the overall like nonfiction work kind of lies. Or would you say that doesn't necessarily have to be the case?
I would lean into my own book as an example, in that you have one overarching theme. The whole thing is about museums, whether it's about their history, appreciating them, their future, any topic that falls into that bucket, that's the book. The book is the big bucket. And then the smaller buckets are all the parts. My book is divided into 7 different parts that have, like 3 or 4 short chapters within each one. I know that sounds really intimidating, but the book is not that long, I promise. But within that, there's these different themes with more storytelling elements. So while I introduce the book in a way that James Clear might, in that like I tell a story, and then I move into a new theme or a topic where I tell more stories, more individualized stories that drive home the point I'm trying to make about X, Y, Z. So the book addresses a lot of different topics within the overarching topic. Does that help to answer your question? Yeah,
definitely. Because I'm curious. I don't know if I'm ever going to write nonfiction, but might as well know more about it. Emily, I know that, in terms of writing historical fantasy or historical fiction, which we've now all are doing or have done, you have to read a lot of nonfiction and be exposed and do a lot of research with nonfiction books. Is there something that you've noticed, even more so just as a reader, that's an interesting takeaway in terms of how nonfiction books kind of tell their story or maintain like a narrative?
I think part of it is just making sure that you're constantly speaking to your why behind writing the novel, or not the novel, I guess in this case, like the nonfiction book. But like that could even transfer as a lot of like the nonfictions that I like to read or that I'll research with are like narrative nonfiction. So even though they are nonfiction, they're still sort of shaped in like a storytelling element and like following some sort of like chronological pattern. But I think it's still about sort of constantly taking your reader back to like that why they should care, why you're writing this book, and like ultimately like what you want them to get out of it.
Definitely. Yeah. That's interesting because I'm thinking about nonfiction books that don't do any of that kind of cohesion, and they ultimately become messy or hard to read, or they kind of fall flat. But that also being said, I don't necessarily think that all nonfiction books have to lean so heavily into making everything this, big cohesive narrative, so to speak, because it is sort of, it doesn't have to be one single narrative in the same way that fiction does. Like, we'd be kidding ourselves to think that it has to tell that same sort of story. But there are storytelling elements, obviously, in terms of anecdotes, and then in terms of what the larger book is doing. So having those thought about beforehand is probably pretty important. And I think I'm going to circle back to a question that we were having, because this sort of leads into another question that any of us can really sort of talk about. How does a writer determine structural decisions then that are made clear to the audience? And this would include, how long your chapters are, how many chapters do you have? Is there a prologue? Is there an epilogue? Are you going to, in terms of nonfiction books, are you going to include charts or bullet points? How are you going to style your book? Those are really important questions in terms of shaping a story. And I'm just wondering what you guys think about specific elements, using them, what's important. Can it be figured out later? Do you have to know it while drafting?
Yeah, there ends up being kind of a Venn diagram of things that are similar and different between fiction and nonfiction in this regard. For example, like chapter length and number of chapters. I still am a firm believer that the sweet spot for chapter length is about 2,000 words. And so for a nonfiction book, number of chapters, 2,000 words, do like 30, and you can go up from there. Depending on genre expectations for a fiction work, you might do anywhere between 30 and 50 chapters at that length. But it really is up to you. But I've noticed that in holding the reader's attention for both fiction and nonfiction, because with nonfiction, you could get bogged down with a lot of information and the reader can get tired. And so it's good to keep the chapters at that length. Reader can also get tired with fiction, but also it keeps the excitement going in that you keep the plot moving, and it makes brain happy when they're like, oh, psych, nice, I finished another chapter kind of thing. And then when it comes to structuring nonfiction in particular, I'm brought back to thinking about how I help authors structure their big idea. And you kind of end up structuring the entire thing with something of a beginning and middle and end, almost like you're writing a assertive essay. Like, this is my point, and my assertive essay is, 50,000 words long, but it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it usually comes in the form of where we are now, like what's the current set of circumstances. And then what's being done is kind of that middle. And then what could be happening in the future? What are the possibilities? What are the global applications? It can kind of be that ending section.
I think overall, and like how I sort of think through some of these things, is it's almost like half knowing and like meeting the expectations of like your genre and of your readers, and then the other half just kind of going with your gut. For different things like the prologue, like not every book has a prologue, and like I write fiction specifically or currently, but like when I was writing Crimson Time, that was sort of like a gut check. I ended up adding a prologue. A lot of people will end up skipping the prologue. So when I do put a prologue in there, I make sure that it's like information that is helpful to the story, obviously, but information that I can also like, ways to like weave in later on, so that if they skip it, they're not missing something like vital, a vital piece of the story. But yeah, I guess as far as like chapter length and everything like that too, I currently write like young adult, so those tend to be like shorter chapters with like more chapter or like higher chapter numbers, again, to kind of like what Mackenzie was talking to, just like time span and like that satisfaction of like those quick, like snappy chapters that you can just sort of like fly through.
Gotcha. Yeah, genre expectations are really important for especially the chapter length and the number of chapters, like you're saying. And I'm thinking of sort of nonfiction genre expectations, at least as a reader. Something I've noticed is there will be books that have maybe just a total of 9 chapters, and they're quite long, but they're broken up into sections beneath that. And that's sort of a concept that doesn't really exist within fiction. So there's a little more that you play around with in terms of how you're structuring your book, depending on what kind of nonfiction book you're writing. You know, a lot of business books do that. And something that's a little more unique to fiction usually is the prologue and the epilogue. And I had never heard until you just said that, Emily, that, you know, your prologue, if it's there, it shouldn't be so vital to the story that if people skip it, they're going to miss something. And I think that's sort of an interesting gut check, because I definitely toyed around with, am I going to include a prologue? Am I going to include an epilogue? And I ultimately was just like, okay, there's nothing about this being a prologue that I can't just include it as chapter 1. And even though, you know, like the last chapter of the book takes place years later, and a lot of epilogues do that, and sort of like, oh, here's what ended. It's still an ending to the story that needed to be a last chapter instead of an epilogue, right? So it's sort of like that concept, you know, tying it to movies, as I often tend to do, and we often tend to do here. You thinking of like after credit scenes, and if somebody were to walk out of the theater right at the end of the movie, are they going to miss something that changes the story? And there have been times where that happens. There have been times where, you know, a scene like changes the context of everything that's gone before it. And maybe don't do that. I don't know. I don't want to step on anybody's like ambitions in terms of having a cool epilogue or whatnot, but erring on the side of just including story elements in the story is probably a good call. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And something that you're reminding me of is a really good example. I like to tie to TV or sitcoms sometimes. The concept of like a flash forward epilogue, where it's either an entire season that takes place 3 years later or 10 years later, however they want to do it, or at the very end of like, for example, in New Girl, like the very last episode, they interweave like a flash forward. So the entire season takes place 3 years later. But in the very last episode, as they're like concluding, they do a flash forward into 10 years into the future. And then they come right back to where the season was, to give you a taste of like, hey, everything's okay. Here's how the characters end up. Just like real quick, 30 seconds. Here's what happens. To
Gotcha.
really satisfy the audience. So without giving anything away, I thought that was an interesting method to do like a quick flash forward instead of an epilogue.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so a lot of those elements that, you know, coming back to books with it, that I think of, like I don't remember ever reading a prologue or an epilogue that stood out to me in my life, where I'm like, that was just such a good prologue, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
I hesitate to say that because there probably are great examples out there, but it doesn't really stand out that much. And kind of taking it back to the chapter length and number of chapters, like you were saying, I think there is a difference between nonfiction and fiction on this one. Mackenzie, you were talking about having like an expectation or a pace in terms of nonfiction, so that the reader doesn't get, you know, tired by the information and has a pattern to kind of, you know, pace them along with the book. And that's important to have, I would say, more so like a range for fiction. And you guys can disagree with me on this, but this is just something that I sort of feel about it. But I like when books implement chapter length variety sometimes, in terms of like novels specifically implement that. Whereas in nonfiction, it's sort of like, when's this chapter end? This wasn't as long as the last one. But with a novel, it's a little more like, oh, that was a quick chapter. Oh my gosh, I might as well go into the next one. Oh, it's a longer one. Okay. And then it just kind of like ebbs and flows a little bit. What do you?
It's weird because there's both expectations, but you can also do whatever you want.
You can break
because, yeah, for example, the shortest chapter in my book, coincidentally, is titled "Size Doesn't Matter," and so it's the shortest chapter. It's around like maybe 800 words, which is like, really, is that a chapter length? Yes, because I decided it was. So you can do whatever you want, truthfully. Like there are certain expectations, but there's also like Emily said, you can break them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like if you're writing whatever it is and you decide like most of my chapters are going to be like shorter in length and I'm going to have a greater number. Like I would never sacrifice like the integrity of a chapter just to like make it match whatever like you've been doing. If you end up having like a longer chapter, like that's fine. Maybe find a way to like do a like section break to like give your reader like that reprieve. But you don't like necessarily have to completely like obliterate it just to like fit the pattern that you've made for yourself. You can break the pattern.
True. Yeah. And it's all about thinking about your reader and what you're accomplishing by doing that. Because yeah, you can totally write a really long chapter if you want, but is the reader going to want to read through it? Is the reader going to enjoy it? Is there a purpose behind it? Does it add anything to have that? Those are questions to consider. And I think back to when I was in the editing process of my book, and this also leads into drafting, because this was something that I was doing subconsciously while drafting, was as I got further along in the novel, I would have like longer chapters, medium, longer, very few short chapters. And then I got to the last section of the book, the last, 50 pages, and it was short chapter, short chapter, short chapter, short chapter. And it was almost like a bunch of like periods or exclamation points at the end of the book. And I didn't notice that I was doing that until I got, placed with an editor and they told me that I was doing that and that they liked it. And it kind of recontextualized how I thought about variety in chapter length and sort of having a plan for how you're going to do it and why. And even if those reasons are subconscious while you're drafting, it's something that might come up later as you get further along. But this is something that we can all relate to in terms of blending history into novels or just writing nonfiction or just thinking about history, is what it's like crafting a scene from real life or experiences, whether or not they're your own, or as I put, the page's blank nothingness, the white page in front of you with the blinking black dash, the nothingness. What are the differences? What's it like? Does anyone have anything burning that they want to, start off with this one?
This is a really good question.
Yeah. Do you base off real life versus how often do you end up just pulling stuff out of thin air? And I think that ends up being a lot of fiction writing, for example, is like I have so much respect for fiction writers because this is hard. Because a lot of it is just making things up, and by making things up, I mean making up the plot. It's entirely your own. You get to write whatever you want. And a lot of times, though, you're also pulling from things that do exist, like things that are real, things that have happened to you, other books or movies that you've watched. Like they say great artists steal, right? Not plagiarize, but like you steal kind of a general framework for things. But you also, train of thought just ran off the tracks. But the idea, I get nervous about writing from personal experience because then I wonder, like I was working on a chapter yesterday where I 100% pulled from personal experience, and I worry about like my parents reading that and going, is that what you really think? It's like, no, it's a character. Like it's just a character. It's not me.
I see what you're
based on
saying.
true events, not necessarily. Yeah.
The names and details have been changed to protect the innocent, kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is something that's I've often thought about because I wrote my book off of an existing, historical figures account of events, and dramatizing or turning that into a novel, narrativizing, I guess you could say, is weird because you are pulling from these stated real life experiences, whether or not, they're true as a primary source, it's hard to tell, but you're pulling from that and implementing other research and you're building a story off of that. And I think what's hard then is knowing when it's okay to embrace the nothingness of the page. If you're implementing things that are real, and especially if they're not yours, it's not like a memoir, it's a historical, or if you're doing nonfiction, like different anecdotes that aren't yours, and how do you incorporate creativity into that? Where does that line begin and end? And what elements are okay to be creative with? And I think something that I struggled with while drafting at the beginning was the character arcs, because I wasn't leaning into the opportunity, because it really is an opportunity that having nothing to go off of provides. and I was using real life or the account as a crutch as I was drafting. And it led to a really strong structure that I could follow, but I wasn't breathing sort of within that. I wasn't drafting really within that. And a lot of the creativity is lost. And that is sort of, it's really an opportunity, I think, for the second half of this, like the blank page. And it's something that you can alternate and go back to. And you can even make that blank page, like you're saying, Mackenzie, pulling from real life in a different way. If you're already pulling from real experiences or real life in a more structured, like set way for your overall book, being able to pull from real life in another angle to like characterize that historical figure or to add life to a situation or to make up an event. You know, if it is fiction, if it's a novel, or if it is nonfiction and you're making a point that you're just making and you don't have to necessarily have it be a real life experience. You can be creative, and it's a blessing. Although it's a scary blessing. It is a scary one, but I still think it's a good one.
Yeah.
I have a general wondering, because in fiction, you can kind of make up whatever you want, right? But a lot of times we do base it on real life. So someone asked the question a couple of weeks ago, did hot dogs exist in the 1930s, right? Like you have to do your research to kind of like write something, right? And it's like, how much does that matter? Because what if you're in your world, maybe hot dogs didn't exist in the 1930s? Like how much would someone call you out and go, wait a minute, that feels like an anachronism, especially with like time travel books. That feels like that's an anachronism, that's out of place. But it's like, but it's my fiction world, I can do whatever I want, right? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's definitely like hard / interesting when you're dealing with history through like a fictional lens. Half of you, like the historian in you, because like Mackenzie and I are both historians, so like we love history, we're passionate about it. The historian in you like wants to do that time period or that event justice. You want to represent it as accurately as you can. But then like the creative like author side of you is like, ooh, what if I like threw this wrench into the things? And you sort of like don't want to sacrifice the story itself for history or sacrifice history for the story. It's almost like a catch-22 sort of like situation. And like you said with time travel, like I play with time travel a lot. So you get to the point where like, what can I sacrifice for the sake of the story? And whenever I sort of get to that spot, I sort of go back to sort of like the overall like arc that I'm building to in the series. And I make sure that if I sacrifice something in history, it's to further that arc. I guess for me, and like I would be interested to like hear you guys' thoughts on this, but for me, I sort of see history or like the heart of history in like the people, not necessarily just like the events or the time period itself. So like when I'm writing history in whatever form that takes, I try my best to sort of represent the people and like their struggles, and like how the events have like affected them, a little bit more so than like the events themselves. Because if I'm breaking an event or I'm breaking like how that event transpired or like what unfolded after it, as long as I'm sort of like staying true to like the heart of history in like my display of like the people and how they're interacting and whatnot, then at least for me, I sort of feel like I'm still like staying true to history at its core.
That's a super interesting topic. I have to imagine that the priorities are different for fiction and nonfiction on this one. I would say that if you're writing a novel, prioritizing story over the accuracy of the details in those moments, if you're forced to choose at various points, is important to prioritize the story. And I would imagine in nonfiction, it's the reverse, because people are reading your book and expecting the details to be accurate. They're hoping to derive that out of the book. As with fiction, you know, they're hoping to get some of that for sure. You know, like as a reader, if you're reading it and you're going, oh my gosh, so there's a hot dog stand. Okay, I guess hot dogs did exist in the 30s. And you go around and tell your friends that, and then you find out it's wrong or whatever. I mean, I don't know. You find out it's wrong. And it's like, oh, because I read it in that novel and it's based in the 30s. And then you're sort of angry and it's like, oh, well, this is less believable then. Like, it's not really rooted in history. And it's like, where's that line? And I believe the word is verisimilitude, believability, like the reality or believability of the world. And if you're rooting things in real life and experiences, that's a very hard balance to find. And it's something I definitely struggled with. And, you know, for instance, I mean, I'm having 15th century people from Spain speaking like some version of like modern day English in the book. Of course, the line is broken at a certain
Yeah.
point, but where does it begin and end? And yeah, that's just a fascinating question.
I think the
I
biggest point to drive home is like, does it matter when it comes to driving home the point that you want to make with your book? So if the hot dog thing is just completely ancillary, then it's just a tiny detail. But if, like, for example, in the book that I'm writing, I'm basing it off of very real life, present day, like relatively recent present experiences with working in a museum, in addition to past experiences with how things were acquired at museums. So I'm representing two very real, like, kind of ideas in a fictitious setting. So if the examples, even if they're entirely made up, they kind of, does that make sense? Like if it matters to the story, if it drives your point home, then that's what measures how critical the detail is.
You know, when I was writing, I almost thought of it as kind of like a range where both ends of the range matter the most. Like the stuff that's super pivotal to your story needs to be true to the heart of what you're getting at. You can't mislead, you know, your readers in fiction or nonfiction if you're basing things in real life and experiences at that high of a level. And on the other hand, there's those really minor details that people are just absorbing as they're reading that contribute more so just to the world and the accuracy. And people are going to take for granted if something's wrong about that. People are going to expect that to be right because, you know, you've done your research. This is that world that you're building. Of course, that, you know, would be right. But then there's sort of like this, at least in my mind, there's this middle area in between where a lot of the interactions and the creativity can happen in between those. And those are sort of like your boundaries that you kind of have to decide as you're drafting. I don't know. Do you guys agree with me? I think I believe you guys do on like the higher level, but in terms of like the smaller details, I know Mackenzie, you're saying that those can be open to creativity. So I'm just wondering what you guys think about how that contributes to believability in a book.
I think that's interesting because that middle ground is almost sort of like where you get to play. Because I know for me, like when I'm reading and other people that I've talked to, it's often like those random, like small details on the like minutia end of things that like people will like randomly remember. And like that's the fun facts that they spout at parties and like stuff like that. So like I guess I never necessarily thought about it in the way that you've sort of described, Vincent, but I almost like that because then when you get to those pieces in the middle where like for me with time travel, when my characters are interacting with like historical figures, like that's where I get to sort of play a little bit more off of the foundation of those like small details and like the overall arching elements of like story and history that are sort of driving it all together.
Yeah, like you know the person, you know their name, but you can kind of play with how they act in a fictitious scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I mean, do you guys have anything more to add on this? I know we all do. We need to have a historical fiction live stream here.
We should.
On Manuscript.
Yeah.
We really do, because there's so much to go over. But I guess sort of any final thoughts from you guys on really the differences between fiction and nonfiction as it pertains to drafting for people going through the NaNoWriMo or NaNoWriMo for books in general.
I do have a thought here for nonfiction too, is like there can be that sort of intimidating element of blank page nothingness. Like you're like, I know I want to write this chapter about, I don't know, libraries, for example. And all you've gotten written on the page is libraries. And you don't really know where to start or quite what to say. You're like, do I want to talk about the history of them? Do I want to talk about someone who works at one, like kind of thing? And one of the biggest solves for me with that was interviewing other people, especially when I got stuck on something, for example, like libraries, where maybe I didn't have a whole lot of experience, unless I wanted to start and open with a story about a time that I went to a library, which is also Like, if you can find whatever tiny element of experience you might have with a thing, even if it's distant, that helps kind of connect the reader into understanding why you're even bothering talking about it. But sorry, to come back to my point, interviewing other people and talking to other people can be really inspiring. And this is a strategy that I've also used for fiction writing. So anytime that there was kind of a certain lived experience that I wanted my character to have, or some kind of background that maybe I didn't personally have, I would draw from other people's experiences by interviewing them. And sometimes those interviews turn into almost nearly direct quotes, like out of the character's mouth, which is kind of a fun moment. So that's something that works for both fiction and non, like transferable strategy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. I guess I know it sort of transfers to both, but I guess to sort of put like a fiction spin on it, is like, don't fear that blank page. I know I tend to like over plan sometimes and not just let myself sit down and like go for it. But in the sense of like doing something like an interview, don't be afraid either to sort of like turn to those outside resources, turn to a novel, find that inspiration. And like Mackenzie was saying earlier, like steal like an artist. Obviously don't like plagiarize it. But like find that inspiration in the ways that you can, and like find a way to like put your own creative spin on it.
Yeah. I mean, especially with nonfiction books and then fiction books that do require research, because all of them do to a certain extent, but more research than others, really absorbing what you're researching, outside resources before you're drafting, and using that as fuel to then put your own book, your own spin on it, your own creative work out there is really important, because then you can refer back to it and it helps inform that as you're drafting, rather than your first exposure to some of these elements being while you're creating, because then it gets really confused and really muddled. So you kind of have to come in with a little bit of a research plan. That's really important. Thank you both for talking to me today, as usual. And thank you everyone for watching. Tomorrow on @manuscripts.ed, is that correct for the Instagram handle? I just need to make sure. Oh, great. I love to get it right. Tomorrow I'll be doing a bit of a writing sprint with you all, more of a casual writing sprint, more of a writing jog on our Instagram live on manuscripts.ed. So please feel free to stop in and write along with me. And we'll keep doing them if you guys are engaged and like it. It might be really fun. Thank you guys. This was quite nice.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Toodles.